Who are the Basmachi? This is a question that continues to provoke much debate and disagreement, as it is quite difficult to determine the exact nature of this phenomenon. Some perceive them as bandits, criminals, simply robbers, while others see them as fighters for freedom, resisting foreign domination and attempts to impose new order. There are also those who consider the Basmachi as heroes, defending their traditions, land, and religious values. Or perhaps all these definitions are combined simultaneously. In the history of Central Asia in the 20th century, this complex and multifaceted topic is especially vivid. It is intertwined with contradictions, passions, clashes of ideologies and cultures, which evoke not only interest but also deep emotions. Some see the Basmachi as fighters for national and religious independence, while others view them as fanatics and enemies of progress, relentless defenders of the old order. But what was their true essence? Why did thousands of people, from ordinary peasants who worked in the fields all their lives, to spiritual leaders and former officers, about 1,500 individuals, take up arms and rise in struggle against the new revolutionary Soviet power? What were they really defending? Islamic traditions, their homeland, the established way of life, or perhaps their personal influence and privileges? The history of resistance to the Basmachi is also a story of a clash between two worlds, one deeply rooted in the Islamic tradition of the East, and the other imposed by the Soviet project. This history is filled with pain and suffering, hopes and betrayals, hopeless struggles and despair. Perhaps within it lies an unrevealed part of our history, which we have yet to fully understand. To grasp the reasons behind the emergence of the Basmachi movement, we must look back to the era preceding their uprising, to the events that took place several decades before its start, to the last years of the Russian Empire. In the early 20th century, Central Asia, including regions like Turkestan, Bukhara, and Khiva, was already part of the Russian Empire. However, this annexation was not an equal or voluntary incorporation. Rather, it resembled colonial subjugation. Along with the Russians came railways, telegraph lines, schools, factories, and plants, all signs of European civilization's interference. But at the same time, new hardships arose. Taxes, requisitions, brutal interference in local traditions, customs, and customs practices. This created deep dissatisfaction and resistance among the local population, leading to the emergence of various movements and ideas. Simultaneously, new intellectual currents began to appear in the region, among which the Jadid movement, Muslim reformers striving to combine Islamic values with Enlightenment ideas, science, and democracy, played a notable role. Part 2 of 12. The Jadids dreamed of modernizing society and advancing progress, but at the same time, they did not want to give up their national and religious identity. They believed that the Muslim population could develop, learn from Europe, adopt its achievements, and still remain faithful to their religion and cultural traditions. These ideas often faced rejection from the traditional clergy and the old elites, who feared losing their privileges and traditional values. A split was brewing in society between supporters of change and those who saw reform as a threat to Islam and the social order. The revolutionary events of the 19th century and the subsequent collapse of the Russian Empire became a decisive moment for the region. The imperial power of the colonial state disappeared, but the question arose, what should replace it? Some were inclined to establish a secular autonomous state within a new Russia, similar to the Kanak Autonomous Region, where national characteristics and cultural self-governance would be preserved. Others believed the only possible path was a return to Islamic tradition and the creation of a state led by religious authorities and emirs, who inherently held power and spiritual authority. A third group, fighting for survival, was forced to struggle against hunger, robbery, and constant regime changes, aiming to preserve their lives and families. It was in this difficult context that the history of Basmachism emerged, as a complex and heterogeneous movement, arising at a time when the old world was collapsing and a completely new one had yet to be built. It is important to note that the emergence of the Basmachi movement was not connected with any singular organizational structure or centralized leadership. The word Basmachi, literally translated from the Turkic language, means those who attack, with connotations of banditry or raids. Initially, this term was used in propaganda by the Soviet side to designate their opponents. However, it should be emphasized that the movement itself, which is now commonly called Basmachism, did not originate as a form of banditry or simple robbery. It was a much larger phenomenon, rooted in deep historical, cultural, and religious traditions. After a tumultuous and quite turbulent year of 1917, events in Central Asian countries took on such a sharp and intense character that they became a real test for the region. These years, filled with revolutionary upheavals, caused chaos and disarray, gradually turning everything around into a pile of shattered hopes and uncertainty. At the center of this whirlpool was the Tashkent Soviet government, which managed to consolidate power and assert itself in the heart of Central Asia, amidst the turbulent waves of change. However, despite the Red invaders establishing their dominance specifically in the capital, Tashkent, the situation in the remote and more distant regions from the center remained extremely difficult and unstable. In the outskirts, where resistance was fought most fiercely, power often changed hands and could shift even within a single day, indicating a great tension and internal fragmentation within this area. During these years, even the most ancient and powerful Khanates and emirates faced the threat of disappearance or serious upheaval. This was especially true for the Khiva Khanate and the Bukhara Emirate, independent entities that, although they maintained their formal independence in official documents, were in fact under serious threat as Soviet troops advanced. In 1920, at the very beginning of the decade, the Red Army launched a large-scale offensive against Bukhara, one of the region's most important centers, taking the brunt of the attack. As a result of these military actions, the emirate was abolished, and its ruler, Emir Alim Khan, was forced to seek refuge in the mountainous regions of eastern Bukhara. It was in these difficult-to-access and often dangerous mountain areas that a true partisan war began, lasting for years and serving as a testament to the resilience of the resistance. This partisan struggle was called jihad, a holy war for faith, just one of the many facets of the complex and multifaceted conflict that arose in the region. The reasons for this confrontation were not solely religious, although religion undoubtedly played a role. The deeper root causes lay in the economic situation, which was growing more severe and hopeless with each passing day. The centuries-old trade routes, which connected regions and facilitated the development of crafts and commercial ties, had been destroyed or seriously disrupted, leading to widespread famine and an increase in poverty among the population. Against this backdrop, living conditions worsened due to requisitions of grain, livestock, and other resources, as well as the forced conscription of cotton, exacerbating people's suffering and instilling fear. These measures, sometimes drawing Russian and Russian-speaking officials to their side, provoked increasing dissatisfaction among the indigenous population, which struggled to adapt to the new order and new rules of life that often contradicted their traditions and way of life. The Soviet authorities introduced radical measures. Sharia courts were abolished, madrasas closed, and interference in family matters and religious rituals became everyday reality. This was felt especially acutely in regions such as the Fergana Valley and eastern Bukhara, where traditional customs, religious practices, and social norms formed an essential part of daily life. In these areas, the first organized forms of resistance emerged, formed along kinship and tribal ties. Participants of these movements called themselves mujahideen, meaning fighters for the faith, or simply rebels rather than basmachi, as the authorities labeled them. The leaders of these movements were respected religious authorities, tribal chiefs, and charismatic military commanders, capable of uniting the local population against a common enemy. In eastern Bukhara, one of the first to organize resistance was an emirate governor, who relied on the support of Sufi orders, which played an important role in mobilizing and boosting the morale of the local residents. By the early 1920s, this movement was joined by the legendary Enver Pasha, a former Ottoman military leader eager to unite scattered detachments and inspire them with ideas of pan-Islamism and liberation. His army, according to various estimates, reached about 12,000 men by the spring of the year 1920, becoming a serious force striving for unity, freedom, and the restoration of former order. At the turn of the century, the Basmachi movement began to develop in Central Asia, reaching its peak when its ranks numbered approximately 100,000 participants. However, this movement was not a single monolithic entity. On the contrary, it was diverse and broadly branched, both geographically and ideologically. What was common to all Basmacas was one: their refusal to recognize the new Soviet government and their view of their struggle as sacred and justified. To Soviet officials, they were merely bandits or enemies of the people. But for a significant part of the regional population, these fighters became a symbol of resistance, hope for a return to age-old traditions and culture of the peoples of Central Asia. Let us try to understand who these Basmachi detachments really were, what motivated the people who took up this path of resistance, and what they represented for the region during those years. In past years, among the participants of armed movements fighting for their interests and ideals, one could see a far from homogeneous mass of people. Here there were not only fervent supporters of a strict ideological platform, inspired to fight for their religious and political beliefs, but also simple peasants armed only with rifles, often having no other training besides basic marksmanship. This struggle, the Basmachi movement, was very diverse in nature. People from various social strata and worldviews joined it. Among them were peasants heavily affected by requisitions of property and devastation caused by violent confiscations and exhausting famine. There were also smiths, nomads, upset by the government's interference in their traditional way of life, religious figures opposing the closure of mosques and Islamic schools, former officers of the Emirates' armies and the Tsarist army, and sometimes even adventurers who saw chaos and conflict as an opportunity to quickly get rich. Try to imagine this kaleidoscope of events, and you will understand that within some combat groups, there could be a Sufi sheikh, a village laborer, a tribal fighter armed to the teeth, and even a former officer of the Tsarist army reading the Quran with a French accent. This was the picture of a diverse tapestry where different faiths, motivations, and outlooks intertwined. This is not a joke or an anecdote, but real life in Central Asia in the 1920s. Many people joined the Basmachi movement through tribal or kinship ties. Often, mobilization occurred through connections within Sufi orders or thanks to charismatic leaders capable of inspiring and uniting disparate groups. Semi-nomadic Uzbek, Kazakh, and Kyrgyz tribes formed the backbone of military units, which later developed into armed formations. However, joining the movement was not always driven by personal desire or ideological conviction. Sometimes in a particular region or situation, Basmachi forcibly mobilized people, persuading or even coercing them to join their ranks. In certain cases, families were obliged to send at least one representative, a jigit, to support the jihad, believing that this would protect Islam and their land from invaders. Some individuals joined the Basmachi out of religious motives or a sense of patriotic duty. They sincerely believed they were defending their faith, justly avenging insults and violence inflicted upon them, or simply saw it as the only way to fight for their survival amid the destruction of their familiar order. During these moments, kinship ties, faith in Allah, and weaponry became sources of support that helped them stay resilient and hopeful. For many, the Basmachi movement became such a pillar, a force that united them during difficult times, allowing them to resist external enemies, defend their interests, and uphold their faith. It is worth pondering what motivated these people to join the ranks of this struggle, and how you might have acted in their place if the fate of your family, community, and religious values depended on your decision. This question is so complex and multifaceted that many researchers agree. The Basmachi movement, by its very nature, was not a unified ideological entity. It was a complex amalgamation of diverse fighting groups, each pursuing its own goals and holding its own views on actions. It was neither a party front nor an underground organization, but rather a conglomerate of units with different strategies, convictions, and motives. For some participants, the struggle might have been a defense of Islamic values, a religious jihad against infidels and enemies of Islam. This idea was especially prominent in Eastern Bukhara and among religious leaders who perceived Soviet power as a destructive force, breaking down the foundations of faith, imposing atheism, and destroying traditional values. Part 6 of 12. For others, driven by more secular or nationalist motives, the struggle was a protest against the existing order. They sought to preserve their land, language, and culture, and to achieve political autonomy. This was especially true for supporters of the so-called Kazan autonomy and advocates of the idea of jihadism, a movement for modernization and educational reforms within the Islamic world. Meanwhile, within this diversity, disagreements and conflicts arose. The Jadids, those who advocated reform, education, secular authority, progress, and modernization, were often opposed to religious fighters calling for a return to the strictness of traditional Islamic order. Where some pushed the country toward the future, developing new ideas and aligning with European standards, others insisted on restoring past arrangements, returning to Sharia, the Emir, and religious laws. Although both sides fought against the Bolsheviks, there was no unity between them unless, as some say, in the fight for freedom in the future. One of the popular slogans of that time was, "Where Muslims are in trouble, you are obliged to come to their aid." This phrase contained a special idea: jihad as a personal, spiritual duty, as an expression of loyalty to one's religion. Such jihad was not only a martial act, but also an inner struggle, capable of demonstrating true commitment to faith and society. It can be said that religion at that moment became both comfort and weapon simultaneously. It was a source of spiritual strength and a motive for action. Consider this: can religion be both a means of comfort and a tool of struggle? That was one of the remarkable features of that era, when faith turned into a powerful weapon to defend one's values and fight against external enemies, while also serving as a source of inner strength and hope. When in some parts of the country there is a call, learn, develop, create a new society, filling hearts with hopes for progress and stability. In other parts of the world, the call is of a different kind. Take up your rifle and avenge the faith, the sacred principles. At such moments, individuals often face a difficult and agonizing choice, especially if they have recently lost everything they had. Their past, familiar life, absence of hope and prospects. All of this forces one to consider what their fate is truly leading them toward: steadfast service to the new order or the familiar struggle for personal survival. The life of the Basmaki is indeed a little studied and complex chapter in history, filled with contradictions and extraordinary events. These people did not resemble typical armed forces or regular armies as we are used to seeing. Their daily existence took place amid constant movement, among mountain ranges, in small villages, isolated oases, where every time they had to find shelter and refuge from persecution. They existed more as semi-guerrilla detachments, which, like nomadic tribes, constantly moved across mountainous and desert regions, sometimes crossing national borders. There was no spectacular endurance typical of regular armies in their constant movement. Their lives were marked by harshness, survival in conditions of complete nomadism, and primitive living conditions. At night, they would retreat into mountain gorges or cliffs, and their food was often very modest and not particularly diverse: simple flatbreads, hot tea, and some dried meat. This environment was shaped not only by their physical hardships, but also by complex relations with local residents. Many local inhabitants, often against their will, were forced to supply the insurgents with food, clothing, horses, and other necessary resources. Some did so out of genuine faith and conviction, supporting them on spiritual grounds, while others under pressure from circumstances, trying to avoid reprisals and punishments. The very participation of individuals in the ranks of the insurgents was often rotational. Families sent their relatives to serve in armed groups for a limited period, say a season or a few months. Afterward, the person would return to their homeland and another would take their place. In this way, a continuous support chain was formed, enabling these small armed formations to operate even in the most inaccessible regions, where most state structures simply could not maintain control or ensure security. One of the most intriguing and significant aspects always remained the source of the weapons used by the insurgents. In Soviet propaganda tradition, they were often portrayed as puppets in the hands of British imperialists, which was partially true. After the end of World War I, Britain, being one of the leading world powers, sought to strengthen its influence in the region, especially in Afghanistan and India. Moscow perceived this as a threat, suspecting that London was trying to support any forces capable of weakening the Soviet Union, particularly along its borders. In this context, the insurgents did indeed receive some support through Afghan territory, Weapons, ammunition were supplied, intelligence units were organized, and instructions transmitted. However, their main supply came from within the region, from local sources, sometimes strangely intertwined with corruption schemes. For example, some Turkmen craftsmen manufactured weapons independently in their workshops and actively used trophies seized in battles. There were even jokes that Soviet troops supplied weapons and equipment to the Red Army soldiers, who in turn sold them to the insurgents for a fee, creating a kind of gray supply chain involving illicit schemes and corruption. Ultimately, it becomes clear that the supply of weapons was primarily sourced from local facilities and involved a much more complex system than simple external influence. Equally important is the fact that Basmachi could not be solely attributed to clandestine, underground existence. They often had families, children, economic ties, and their own channels to markets, making them not just armed detachments hiding in the mountains. They had supporters among the local elite, trusted individuals who assisted them and supported their activities. In this way, the Basmachi formed a structure that resembled an alternative society with its own rules, taxes, and even an internal code of honor. In the context of a collapsing state system, they were not just fighters for freedom or resistance. They created a sort of autonomous authority with its own laws, often difficult for central authorities to control. Attempts by the Soviet government to suppress the Basmachi began as early as 1920, immediately after the revolution, but the full scale of the struggle became apparent a bit later. Especially active and extensive military campaigns against the Basmachi unfolded after the fall of the Khiva Khanate and the Bukhara Emirate in 1920, significantly altering the regional landscape. At that time, the fight against the Basmachi became not only a matter of military necessity for the Red Army and Soviet state, but also part of a broader goal: to eliminate any resistance pockets and establish control over this remote region, ensuring further development and strengthening of the new socialist system. Across Central Asia, complex and tense battles took place, staged in various theaters of operations. These included key territorial zones such as the Fergana Valley, eastern Bukhara, as well as territories of Turkmenistan in the Karakum Desert. In each area, specially organized units were formed to combat insurgents and resisting guerrilla groups. These formations included subdivisions of the internal NKVD, actively fighting illegal formations, units of the Cheka, the Extraordinary Commissars, and cavalry units designed for rapid response and striking at the enemy. However, this struggle proved far more complex than any frontline engagement, as the opposition was based not merely on armed confrontation, but involved guerrilla resistance, fundamentally different from conventional combat. Basmachi detachments did not engage in traditional frontal battles and clashes with regular armies in open terrain. Instead, they favored stealth. They disappeared among mountain ranges, faded into small villages and hamlets that appeared peaceful at first glance, only to suddenly reappear on the scene and deliver unexpected strikes against Soviet forces. Their tactics included surprise attacks, secrecy, and the ability to disappear quickly, making them a very difficult target for pursuit. Especially for the first time in the history of Soviet power, they faced a classic form of guerrilla resistance, and it was clear that existing measures to combat this phenomenon were insufficient. Over time, methods of opposition became more complicated. An essential aspect was the work of intelligence and an undercover network. Agents infiltrated enemy detachments with their own people. Bribes were offered, and information was gathered about the plans and movements of underground groups. Psychological methods were also employed, spreading various types of information, part of which was convincingly delivered in local languages and dialects, thereby intensifying their influence on the minds of local residents and potential rebels. Promises of amnesty to those willing to surrender, along with guarantees of forgiveness and land for those switching sides, sometimes proved quite effective, encouraging part of the population to betray and shift their loyalty. More sophisticated and psychological techniques were also used in the fight. For example, messages supposedly sent on behalf of the emir himself, the resistance leader, were dropped from airplanes containing words like, "The resistance is useless, I have left. Save yourselves." Some residents believed these messages, others were skeptical, but a certain number succumbed to this influence and decided to surrender, which under the specific conditions was a significant victory for Soviet forces. Aviation played a particularly important role in this struggle, a symbol of modernity and nearly mystical powers. Aircraft, perceived by locals as something almost divine, flying high in the sky, could drop bombs directly on villages where rebels hid. This technology deprived the Basmachi of their main advantage, mobility and concealment, making them vulnerable and unpredictable. The main task for Soviet forces was to destroy the myth of the Basmachi as defenders of faith, traditions, and the people. The Soviet press actively participated in this effort. Agitation groups were organized, leaflets and poetry were distributed, and feature films were produced with the aim of shaping a negative image of the enemies. At the same time, extreme measures were employed, including repressions against the families of Basmachi fighters, mass arrests, deportations, and harsh Red Terror, which even reached mountainous and hard-to-access regions. Within 2 years of the start of large-scale battles by 1920, most influential resistance leaders had been eliminated. Enver Pasha fell in battle, Muzafer Maksum fled abroad, and Ibrahim Bek, one of the most well-known commanders, was hiding in Afghanistan. Despite the elimination of key figures, the fight continued. Small detachments of Basmachi, often consisting of only a few men, led a nomadic lifestyle. They hid in caves, crossed borders, carried out sudden raids, and disappeared just as quickly as they appeared. By the early 1930s, specifically in 1930, we can speak of the actual collapse of the resistance organization. It ceased to exist as a unified, organized, and controllable movement. The remaining groups, consisting of a few dozen people, were either completely destroyed or fled abroad, mainly to Afghanistan. The key leaders, such as Ibrahim Bek, who became a symbol of unwavering resistance in Tajikistan, were either killed or arrested. Ibrahim Bek was captured in 1931 and, after a brief trial, executed in Tashkent. With his death, the last hope for the revival of an Islamic refuge in Bukhara or other regions associated with this movement was finally lost. Some Bukharan rebels who went into exile found refuge in countries like Kabul, Tehran, or Pakistan, where they continued to preserve the memory of their struggles. In their memories, books and memoirs, legends and recollections remained, sometimes conveyed through oral stories and sometimes in the form of political documents. Among the emigrant manuscripts, there were those that explicitly admitted, "We lost because we couldn't unite and organize properly, but we were never wrong." Overall, the image of the Basmachi in popular consciousness persisted as a symbol of defiance, of fighting for one's ideals and faith, often distorted by Soviet propaganda, which portrayed them as criminals, religious fanatics, and enemies of the people. This portrayal was reinforced in textbooks, films, and literature, creating a certain, often one-sided history of their struggle. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1930, there began a reassessment of the role and significance of the Basmachi in the history of Central Asia, gradually changing the approach to their image and perception. Perceptions of events related to the Basmachi underwent centuries of shifts and nuances. For some, they became symbols of the fight for freedom and independence. For others, Islamic heroes fighting for their faith and traditions, and for yet others, mere tragic figures caught in a brutal and merciless historical grinder, with no room for choice and no support from modern values. In contemporary society, in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, discussions about the history of the Basmachi are actively ongoing in both academic circles and among the general public. Their names regularly appear in various blogs, books, and sometimes even in textbooks, reflecting the complex and often contradictory nature of this period. Some seek to legitimize them as national heroes, glorifying their deeds and ideals, while others prefer to remain silent, avoiding overly positive assessments. The Basmachi movement belongs to the past. Its armed conflict ended long ago, but questions related to its historical role and the fate of the Basmachi themselves remain relevant today. Why did they lose? Did they have a chance to win, or were they doomed to defeat from the very beginning? Could Central Asia have taken a different development path, rejecting both the Soviet and fundamentalist options? And most importantly, who were the Basmachi, heroes or traitors, fanatics or ordinary people caught on the other side of the historical front? The history of the Basmachi movement is not just a story of war, resistance, or struggle. It is a deep and complex narrative about how entire worlds collapse and how people are forced to make life-changing choices between the past and the future. In every era, such decisions can be pivotal and even dangerous because their cost may, and often does, turn out to be too high, even life itself. At those times, many people, driven by faith, tradition, and love for their homeland, sided with the Basmachi, believing it was their duty to fight for ideals that mattered more to them than anything else. Their hearts were filled with conviction that this was the only right way to act. At the same time, others followed the path of Soviet authority, seeing in it a chance for education, development, and modernization of society. They hoped that socialist ideas would open doors to a new life, justice, and equality, things they had long deserved. Both sides sincerely desired a better future. Only their visions of that future were fundamentally different. Despite all its heroic or tragic manifestations, the Basmachi movement failed to become the driving force capable of changing the course of history and securing victory. But even as an unsuccessful and inconsistent movement, it left a deep, multi-layered, and contradictory mark on the fates of Central Asian peoples. This mark still sparks heated debates, fierce discussions, and reflections. And even more than a century after active armed resistance ended and all historical arguments were exhausted, we continue to ask ourselves the same question. Who exactly were the Basmachi? Were they heroes of their time, brave fighters for freedom, or conversely, tragic figures who suffered terribly from circumstances? Perhaps they were simply victims of their era or shadows of a vanished world, forever frozen in the past. This complex and multifaceted history teaches us that the past is rarely as straightforward in black and white as it is sometimes portrayed. It is far more intricate, rich, and layered, often filled with multiple meanings and interpretations. Because history is an unending weave of events, personal actions, ideals, and mistakes that shape the image of an entire epoch. And this understanding helps us to view the past with greater depth and respect for the difficult fate of those on the other side of the historical divide. How do you perceive the figures of the Basmachi? Do you see them as heroes, tragic victims, or perhaps something else? What feelings do these historical characters and events evoke in you? Sharing your thoughts is very important, because true understanding is born in dialogue. By discussing the past, we learn to better understand ourselves and our ancestors, as well as strengthen our ability to distinguish shades and nuances in complex human destinies. Ultimately, this skill makes us wiser and better prepared to make decisions that can influence not only the fate of individual nations, but also the future of our countries.